OPB Podcasts.
From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, November 20th. As the school calendar shifts into holiday mode, public school students are about to head off on vacation. And as families brace for time off, educators are bracing too for potential budget cuts. And that's as Oregon's education system remains one of the worst performing in the nation. Plus, we're going to hit on some of the demands the Trump administration is making of colleges in the Pacific Northwest. It's a bit of an education grab bag this week. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Lauren Dake.
And I'm education reporter Ellizabeth Miller.
And I'm higher education reporter Tiffany Camhi.
Great, thank you. All right, Liz, let's start with you. Oregon state agencies were asked to prepare for potential budget cuts next year. The revenue forecast released this week was a little bit better than expected, but cuts are still likely coming. What would that mean for K-12 public schools in this state?
Yeah, it's not great news. This week kind of gave us our first look at what might be a bleak couple of years for Oregon education funding. And this is kind of in part due to federal funding cuts kind of coming down to the state level. And so the Oregon Department of Education, the Department of Early Learning and Care, and the Higher Education Coordinating Commission all had to share their plans for how they'd cut 2.5% of their budget and 5% of their budget. And this is millions of dollars, big amounts of money. And that's on top of existing money challenges from things like declining enrollment and rising costs. So at the K-12 level, the proposal included reducing programs like Future Farmers of America and STEM programs. And what the Oregon Department of Education was trying to do with these cuts was not necessarily take away from core instruction, the math, the English, all that stuff, but instead try to cut around some of that additional programming that we have for students. But one big part of the proposal would be eliminating Oregon's Educator Advancement Council. And this is an organization that kind of supports professional development for teachers. And it also supports the state's Grow Your Own efforts, which is basically students becoming teachers in the districts that they worked in. And it's been really successful. Tiffany, what's going on at the higher ed level?
Yeah, so you mentioned the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, and just for our listeners that don't really know what that is, it's not ingrained in higher ed like I am. They have three main duties, and that's to set post-secondary standards and policies for the state of Oregon. They administer state financial aid to Oregonians going to college, and they coordinate funding to the state's 7 public universities and 17 community colleges. So they also had to do this budget proposal cut exercise. This biennium, I think they had $4.4 billion in their budget. Most of that money is going straight to community colleges, universities, and state financial aid for Oregonians. And there's a mix of good and bad news here. The good news is that the Oregon Opportunity Grant, which is the state's largest need-based financial aid program for students, and the Tribal Student Grant are untouched. So they're not taking any money out of that. HEC's director, Ben Cannon, told lawmakers that similarly to ODE, we're trying to have the least harm. What is the least harm that we can do to our students? And they prioritized those student grants. The bad news is that because they left those programs untouched, they took a lot of money away from, or they could take, because this is a proposal, right, a lot of money away from public universities and colleges. And this is support that these higher education institutions really rely on to balance their budgets. And it's, the bad news is that this could, because they're taking money away from these institutions, they don't have many other options other than to raise tuition for students, which all of the public universities have done over the past 10 years. They continue to raise tuition and just making the cost of college even higher and more out of reach for some students. And it is likely to result in more layoffs at universities and community colleges.
I think you guys both did a nice job of emphasizing that this is an exercise, but I'll just say that again, that this is not an unfamiliar exercise that the governor has state agencies go through when we are expecting budget cuts. But we don't know what the budget cuts are going to look like yet. But one thing we do know is that the state's public schools have been struggling for a very long time. Liz, you've been covering this for a long time. Just give us a little bit of background on why Oregon public schools have just performed so poorly for so long.
Yeah, it's a very complicated question. But, before I get into the, things are not great, I do want to point out that things are better than they were. So we are wrapping up this long-term Class of 2025 project here at OPB. And when the project started, Oregon's graduation rate was 69%. The latest graduation rate for the Class of 2024 was 82%. So just want to point out.
I'm snapping.
Yes. There has been growth. There has been improvement. But while Oregon has been improving, so have other states. And so the state is still at the bottom of those national ranking when it comes to something like a graduation rate. But also when you look at things like test scores, attendance, and chronic absenteeism, Oregon is still at the bottom of these national rankings. And I think that was the whole point of one of the points of our project, was to kind of figure out, like, why is that? And I think there is a big piece of it is kind of the state setting the tone for school. And the fact that school, I feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect in, the importance of going to school and why graduating from high school matters. And so there's kind of, I don't know, it's something that I think has a lot of possible answers as to why we're doing so poorly in those ratings, in those rankings. But I feel like the state continues to kind of not prioritize school. And, students that we followed in the Class of 2025 project, they, didn't feel connected to school. They didn't necessarily have the relationships with staff and with folks at school that felt like they could feel supported. And then, of course, COVID and the pandemic and distance learning just ruined all of that. It's some of the things we've noticed, like Oregon's chronic absenteeism. So that's like the rate of students who miss 10% or more of school days. That rate of chronic absenteeism didn't increase. It was already increasing before COVID, is what I'm trying to say. Test scores were already declining before COVID, and COVID just made everything worse. And Oregon is still trying to crawl out of that. And I would say there's a lot more that could be done to really help make that progress happen. I mean, a third of students still missed 10% or more of school days last year. Like, that's not good. And we still have a lot of work to do. And I think there's a lot of conversations that are now being had at the state level of how do we work on this? How do we do better? How do we help students? But it's not a super great picture right now.
It's a complicated landscape,
yes,
as you mentioned. I think one thing I know at my son's elementary school is there's a lot of concern about declining enrollment. And I think that's a statewide concern as well. Again, I'm throwing another complicated question your way.
That's okay. They're all complicated.
Explain this, Liz. Where are the students going?
Here's an answer. We don't really know. But one thing. Okay, so just to kind of set the table here for what this looks like. I mean, I know at your son's school, it's probably a couple hundred kids, maybe. Statewide, enrollment has dropped by more than 37,000 students since COVID in Oregon.
Wow.
Crazy. And this is one thing where enrollment had been increasing before COVID. And so some things we know. Number of families homeschooling increased a lot, especially in the first couple of years of the pandemic. We also know some families chose private school for their kids. But getting those actual enrollment numbers is super complicated, and it's not something that Oregon collects on a statewide basis. We also don't really know how many families left Oregon in the pandemic, and that's another reason for that decline in enrollment. And then the one big reason that folks point to is declining birth rates. I feel like I feel like I talk about it all the time, and I hear it whenever I ask anyone about declining enrollment. And it's something that will continue to affect Oregon schools. But I think the answer is way more complicated than just declining birth rates. I mean, we've seen enrollment drop in almost every grade in Oregon. I feel like that can't be explained by less babies or fewer babies.
Right. And I guess private schools don't have to share their enrollment figures because they're private, and so we don't know that.
Yeah, and so I talked to a national economist who did this whole study about what he called like unaccounted for students, which are students that didn't show up in the public school rolls, didn't show up in private school surveys. So that's kind of the system for tracking private school enrollment, at least at a national level, is a survey that not every school fills out, right? And so what they did was look at that private school survey data and the public school enrollment data, and then compared that to census data, like how many young people do we have in Oregon? And they found a huge gap in, like, we have more young people in Oregon, but they're not necessarily showing up in schools. So that's definitely something that I want to explore more, especially the homeschooling bump. So stay tuned.
Yeah, sounds like you have some story ideas.
I really do.
Okay, so we've mostly been talking about state level issues here so far, but there's obviously a lot happening on the federal level as well. Tiffany, one story you recently wrote about was the Compact for Academic Excellence in Higher Education. I love education jargon, not really. Tell us what that is.
Okay, so yeah, this compact is a proposal from the U.S. Department of Education, and it basically just outlines all of the Trump administration's priorities for higher education. So it has provisions to change the way schools do their admissions process. There's a provision about campus free speech policies and making sure everyone can say what they want to say. Changes to faculty hiring, changes to tuition, a long list. I think it was like 10 pages. And in exchange for universities and colleges signing on to this compact, the government promises quote-unquote federal benefits, but it doesn't really talk about what those federal benefits are. But just like the paragraph before the federal benefits thing, it talks about here's all these things that we do for you, universities and colleges, and they talk about student loans, which are so important for universities and colleges to have access to those loans. It's very important to their bottom line. Research grants, which I don't know if we all know, but a lot of us know that the Trump administration has basically held hostage research grants from a lot of universities this past year. Approval of student visas for like international students and like certain tax advantages. So they introduced this compact to a handful of universities last month. None of them were in Oregon or Washington. And then they basically expanded it to like any school a few weeks later in the middle of October. And the deadline to sign on to the compact is Friday. November 21st.
Oh, tomorrow.
Yes.
So what do you know about how Oregon universities are responding to this?
Yeah, so I reached out to all of our public universities, the 7 public universities. I also reached out to OHSU, Oregon Health and Science University. They're not really counted as a public university because they're more of like a hospital system, but they do educate students, and they have like a lot of money tied up in research, federal research grants. And I reached out to a handful of our private institutions about like, hey, what are you going to sign this? Like, what do you think about this? And the responses that I got mostly fell into 2 categories. A few universities were like, no, we're not considering this and we are not going to sign it. Everyone else either just did not respond to me or said, oh, well, the federal government never contacted us about this. So that's what I've gotten from Oregon's universities. And I will say that this it mirrors the responses that a lot of other universities and colleges throughout the nation have been saying about this compact. There's only a handful of schools that are outwardly saying, no, we're not going to sign it. Everyone else is just like staying quiet, staying low, which is a trend among universities this year. Like no one wants to draw the ire of President Donald Trump. No university leader wants to become the next Brown University, Harvard, Columbia, and we all know they're going through a lot. Do you want to know which schools in Oregon said no?
Yeah,
I can tell you that.
Yeah, tell me.
Tell us.
The definitive no's are Portland State University,
Okay.
Eastern Oregon University, University of Portland, and Pacific University. And I will say there's like about 6,000 higher education institutions throughout the entire nation, and only 3 of those schools have said that they would sign it.
And what schools are going to sign it?
A small school in Florida, a public school in Texas. Sorry, I don't know that. It's Texas, Florida, and Tennessee.
Okay.
The Tennessee one is a military academy that educates like 40 people a year.
Okay. Well, something else that you've written a lot about and has been in the news a bit is the Trump administration's take on admissions. There's a lot of talk about changes on the admissions front. Why did you take a deeper dive into this topic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the reason why we at OPB decided to follow this is because there's been so many changes to higher education over the past year. The Trump administration has really targeted higher ed, saying that universities are places that harbor quote unquote woke ideologies, and it's a place where anti-Semitism is growing, and free speech is stifled. And then there's just been all of these memos, directives aimed at universities to kind of like get rid of all those things. And one of the more recent ones is a memo on admissions policies. And I would say, so in this memo from the Trump administration, they're demanding that colleges report admissions data of students who are just applying to school. They want to know more things about their race. They want to know their gender. They want to know test scores. And the reason that they're doing this is because the Department of Education wants these schools to prove that they're following the law and not considering race in the admissions process. They basically just don't believe that some schools are no longer using race in admissions. And I say following the law because in 2023, the Supreme Court got rid of race-based affirmative action. So, like, no school is supposed to do this anymore. The big reason why we decided to do this story is because those policies, almost all of these policies coming down from the Trump administration are aimed at elite selective institutions, a handful of institutions, like not that many in the U.S. And in Oregon and Washington, like I can count the number of selective institutions on one hand. There's just like 2. So all these things, all these changes happening to higher ed don't really impact or don't have a huge impact on a lot of the schools in Oregon and Washington, because the schools here are what's known as open access institutions, which means like their mission is to educate as many students as possible, no matter their race, no matter their background. So it's kind of just like illuminating that. And I do want to say there's still a lot of federal directives that are impacting students, like there's been cuts to student support programs. And again, there's like all the holding hostage of the research grants. So I'm not saying that there isn't a huge impact to Oregon and Washington institutions, but the Trump administration has really been going after the Harvards and Columbias and Browns.
Right. Okay. Well, one thing that we talked about a while ago, and people may remember, is the federal administration's pledge to dismantle the Department of Education. And that has sort of bubbled back up. And it appears now that several parts of the federal agency will now be under control of a very familiar name to Oregonians, Labor Secretary and former Congresswoman from Happy Valley, Lori Chavez DeRemer. What do you know about that?
Well, I can tell you that earlier this year, they did an experiment where they being the U.S. Department of Education, at the beginning of their dismantling efforts, they moved one program, one like sub-agency, to the Department of Labor, to Chavez DeRemer, what she is in charge of. And that is the workforce programs. And I know that she's been known to like talk a lot about workforce stuff. It's like a big like labor advocate. So like that kind of, it made sense for that to go be one of the first sub-agencies, sub-programs to go to the Department of Labor. Earlier this week, the U.S. Department of Education announced that, hey, that was such a success. We're going to start moving all of these other programs to other agencies now. And so now Chavez DeRemer has 2 more from the U.S. Department of Education housed under the Department of Labor. And I believe it's secondary, so like K through 12 programs, and post-secondary higher education programs will now also fall under the Department of Labor. And I don't know what that means. Yeah, I did talk to our colleague Bryce Dole, who's done a lot of reporting on Chavez DeRemer, and I basically asked, well, what's her background in education? And he was like, I don't know. She doesn't talk about it that much. So what does this mean? I don't know. We will investigate this.
Yes.
Okay.
We will definitely be looking into that. But one point that concerns me is just the loss of institutional knowledge with all of those changes. And also, I'm just very worried about like how we collect data for schools, because so much of it goes to the Department of Education, and we don't really know what that looks like. And I know, folks, academics, experts, people that study this are a little nervous.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both. Before I let you go, though, I do just want to flag something that you brought up earlier, Liz, is your amazing Class of 2025 project, something that you have been thinking, talking about, living through, working on for a very long time. Just such a cool project. Do you want to just give us, our listeners who maybe haven't watched the amazing documentary yet or seen all the stories, like a quick rundown on what the latest is there and the project's idea?
Yeah. Thanks, Lauren. I don't know.
Plug, shameless plug.
Thanks
Liz,
for the plug.
Shameless plug time. Go.
So OPB has been doing this really cool long-term project called the Class of 2025. It came out of former Governor Kitzhaber's goal that by 2025, 100% of Oregon students would graduate high school. My boss at the time, was a reporter, Rob Manning. He was like, let's follow some students and see what that actually looks like. And so we've followed a group of kindergartners all the way through school. And we saw them change schools. We saw them learn to read. We saw them go through a pandemic in the middle of 7th grade and then return back to high school and all the things that brought. And so the documentary that you're talking about just came out earlier this month, and it's an hour, and it's on YouTube. And it really charts the lives of 7 of these students. We couldn't put all of them in the documentary, but it follows these students through those times. We see them, as little kids talking about what they want to be when they grow up. We see them doing gym class at home during COVID, one of the most awkward scenes of the whole film. And then we get to see them graduate, and for some of them didn't graduate, and we get to learn more about why. So that's the high level. We just had a screening with a few of the students, and they were there, and we had a panel. And it was so great to see. A couple of them are in college. At least one of them is the first in her family to go to college. So yeah, just kind of that project is closing down, I guess. And we will have a couple more stories from some students who weren't featured in the documentary, but who have some really interesting educational journeys. So I'm excited to share those soon.
It's such a cool project, and I think on this podcast, we really showed how complicated the policy is. Mm-hmm. It's a chance to see through the human perspective what it's like going through the system and explain some of these complicated projects through these kids' experiences. So anyway, it's worth checking out. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded in the Gert Boyle studio. It was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Nalene Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. We will share a link to the fabulous Class of 2025 project, including the 1-hour documentary Liz discussed, in the episode notes. It's a must-watch. Next week is Thanksgiving, and we will likely take the week off. That sounds good. So, barring any major news, we will be back in December with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening.